Alright, let's talk about another one of our literary theories. Let's talk about existentialism. Existentialism is definitely one of the more difficult literary theories to wrap your head around, and normally we talk about it last because it really takes into account all the other literary theories that come before it, or at least the ones that did come before it. There have been others following existentialism. I'm the type of person who's really, really obsessed with philosophy. It's part of the reason why I actually kind of like Marxism. But existentialism is the philosophy and the literary theory that most appeals to me. Normally, when I teach 1102, I teach an existential reading of a current webcomic called Bittersweet Candy Bowl. And it is a really hard theory to wrap your head around because it's very abstract. The best way for me to describe existentialism is to start with its historical context. There were many existentialists in the 1800s. You had Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Heidegger, which you want to read some really intense weirdness. Look up Heidegger. I mean, most people will read a couple of pages of Heidegger and not even comprehend what they just read. He also was a card-carrying member of the Nazi Party, and he never really renounced it. I mean, he did a lot afterwards, and he didn't seem to be an enthusiastic member of the Nazi Party, but it's been a bit of a smudge on him for his entire career. Now, all these existentialist philosophers led up to what I would consider the paragon of existentialism. That's kind of my personal take on it, and that's Jean-Paul Sartre. If you never have to read Jean-Paul Sartre, count yourself lucky, because most people would rather jump off a building than read Jean-Paul Sartre. I mean, I love Jean-Paul Sartre, but he is not easy to read, and he's even harder to understand. And Sartre really brings about the close textual reading of existentialism that I personally love to apply to literature. Now, what did Sartre think, and what were his ideas? That's not an easy thing to explain, so I'll have to use a couple of hypotheticals to kind of demonstrate this to you. Existentialism's main points are stuff that should seem laughably obvious, but the wisdom and the stuff that it exposes are crazy complex. Now, existentialism basically is the assumption that existence, being, precedes essence. You have no essence until you exist. It seems kind of innocuous, right? It kind of takes the whole Descartes thing, I think, therefore I am. It flips it around. I am, therefore I think. Now, a lot of y'all are probably like, right? I mean, that's the way most normal people react to that. Well, it was pretty big for its time, because you have to remember, even in our modern context, essence does not precede crud. I'm getting it all backwards. Essence does not precede existence, right? Or it does precede. Dang it. All right. Ah. Yeah, even I'm getting all turned around. This is difficult stuff. How about this? This flies in the face of Christianity and most major religions. Most major religions argue that you have a soul, that you have an eternal soul. And the Bible says that God knew you before you were formed in the womb. That is a basic contradiction to existentialism, because existentialism says you didn't exist before you existed. There was no essence. There was nothing of you before you began to think. Now, most existentialism, there's a few examples. Kierkegaard's really the only one. But most of the existentialists were also avowed atheists. Meaning that the theory itself can be a little bleak and despairing. But Sartre would have argued that point. Again, this is all really high-minded philosophical gobbledygook, right? What does this have to do with literature? Surprisingly, a lot. And here's why. Well, crud, I'm trying to work my way into it, but it's hard to do this without really giving you the background on it. Sartre wrote his principal text, Being and Nothingness, based upon his experience in World War II and the aftermath of it. Now, Jean-Paul Sartre was a French resistance fighter basically fighting against the Nazis in France. Now, after or during the Nuremberg trials, after the war was concluded, you had a lot of Nazi leaders and a lot of people who were at the death camps who were using the excuse that I'm not responsible for all those people I killed. I was just following orders. Now, Sartre had been experimenting with existentialism before this. He was probably already an avowed atheist. He was already the kind of guy who talked a lot about responsibility and thought a lot about, the fact that man creates himself. That's one of the big points, is that man is responsible for his own being and his own essence. And when he heard these Nazi criminals talking about the genocides and the Holocaust in these terms, it infuriated him, because that's not a tenable excuse. If you're following orders, you are making a choice to follow those orders. You still are responsible for the things that you've done. Now, you have the freedom to not follow those orders and potentially be imprisoned yourself. But you had a choice. There was never a lack of choice for you. Now, after that, Sartre really came to some amazing moralistic thinking with existentialism. The idea that we create and are totally responsible for ourselves. And we are only the product of the choices that we make. Now, again, for most of you, this probably seems kind of obvious. It's like, of course I'm responsible for the choices I make. Well, do you act that way? Do you honestly, and this might be a good discussion question for this or next week, do you honestly live your life like you're truly responsible for all the things that you do? Like, take for instance, if you're late to class or your paper's late, and don't worry, I'm not singling any of you out right now, your first instinct is likely to say something along the lines of, my car broke down. The weather was bad this morning. My alarm didn't go off. We instinctively blame things outside of ourselves to absolve ourselves of our responsibility. Now, this is natural. We're human, and we have a desperate drive to escape our responsibility and to lie to ourselves and say, no, I'm not responsible for what I am. Something else has done that for me. That is what Sartre called bad faith. And bad faith, it actually doesn't have anything to do really with religion. It's you're convincing yourself of a falsehood. You are lying to yourself. You are putting yourself in bad faith. Some of my favorite examples of bad faith. I don't have credit trouble. I'm just going through a rough patch. You know what? This girl I like, she might be with that other guy, but that'll be over soon. She'll call me back. These are all kind of bad faith examples. Now, the real big example that Sartre showed us was an example that he said he actually saw in a cafe once. This is like the absolute worst case scenario from an existentialist standpoint. A woman works at a restaurant. Her boyfriend is abusing her physically. He's hurting her. She tells her friend about it. Her friend tries to get her to leave. The boyfriend comes and confronts them both at the cafe. The boyfriend tries to physically remove the girl from the restaurant. The friend tries to pull her in the other direction. Now, at this point, she must make a choice as to who she wants to go with. But a lot of us, out of fear of making our choice, will go limp and let these two people fight over us and see who wins. That is choosing to not choose. I'm starting to see that I'm probably going to have to split this video in two parts, because existentialism is another one of those things that I can just ramble when I get going on it. But choosing to not choose is a false choice. That is not a choice at all. You are 100% giving in to bad faith because you're refusing to take responsibility for yourself. Well, you've chosen to completely disengage the process, and you are no longer creating yourself. You are just kind of going with the flow. That's bad. You can't do that. That is bad faith. Now, and don't worry, I'll bring in a literary perspective to this in a minute, but we all exist in some degree of bad faith. Some of us are a lot better at lying to ourselves than others. I think this shirt looks good. I'm very much in bad faith, right? I think my hair is cool. Now, when I realize that's not true, or when I first kind of get the inkling of the truth, and I start to sense its inevitability, that puts me in a different state. That state is dread. Dread is the constant anxiety that we feel when we sense our responsibility hanging over us. This is a nagging feeling, and it drives us kind of crazy when we're constantly trying to escape our responsibilities by lying to ourselves about all the mean, horrible things that the world has done to us. You're in dread. You know it's there. You know it's there. You're running from it. It is a hellish thing to be in. Now, from dread comes despair, and also anguish. These are all words you've heard before, emotions, but the existentialists co-opted them into new terms that had technical meanings. Anguish, despair, is a little different from plain dread. This is when you recognize the inevitability that you're not going to be able to keep lying to yourself. Despair is pretty sucky. When I look at myself in the mirror and I see, and I'm like, I don't think this shirt looks good. I don't think my hair is doing what I think it's doing. But no. I'm sticking with it. I've moved from plain dread to anguish. My boyfriend treats me terribly. I'm scared. But maybe he'll still change. Welcome to anguish. The creditors are calling my house. And they're calling and they're calling. My wife is suspecting. Welcome to anguish. It's catching up with you, right? You're not going to be able to lie to yourself much longer. Keep telling yourself you're fine. You're coming to that truth. And we will resist that truth. We will fight tooth and nail to not have to claim it. To not be responsible, to not have to stand up and say, yeah, I suck with money. Yeah, I have terrible taste in the people I date. I have lost 3 years of my life with a partner who physically abuses me. We will run from that, and we will run, and we will run, and we will run, until we finally come to the rarest state of all, which is authenticity. Authenticity is something that not very many people get really to experience. Authenticity is when you finally pick yourself up and you start to take responsibility for the things that you're doing and the things that you've experienced and the things that you are. I'm breaking up with John today and I'm leaving. Or I'll stay with John no matter what, even though he abuses me. I'm going to go to a credit counselor because I'm bad with money. Or I'm going to turn all this over to my wife and I'm going to do what she says because I can't. These are fleeting moments of authenticity. Now, authenticity has a tendency to not really stick around very much. We shift in and out of authenticity because just when I get out of my credit woes, I'll probably start spending again, right? Now, my monitor went off. What does this have to do for literature? A lot. If you look at our stories and you look at our texts, sometimes, I would argue most of the time, you'll see a character who's lying to themselves and constantly trying to get away from a truth they're not ready to accept. For Ichabod Crane, it might be that Katrina doesn't take him seriously. For Edgar Allan Poe and the speaker in Ligeia, it might be that his wife is dead. For any number of poetry speakers, this is a constant motif. We'll discuss this more later. Thank you.